Here, we'll do it this way. Let's start out with what is the exposure triangle and why is it important? I guess let's get started. So this is going to be, we'll see if it's a three-part series on understanding the basics, but I'm going to try to do 3 videos. This first one is going to be understanding the exposure triangle for beginners. Here, we'll do it this way. Let's start out with what is the exposure triangle and why is it important? The exposure, your exposure of your camera or the exposure of your pictures basically means getting your picture at the right balance of brightness and darkness. You don't want your picture to be too blown out, white, bright, where you can't see anything, and you don't want it to be too dark that you can't see anything. So if you're outside on the beach, you're going to have a different exposure setting than if you are indoors or if you're taking pictures at night. Getting that right balance, depending on the time of day, your location, just depending on the situation, you're going to have to adjust your exposure to get the right balance of light for that image. So today in this video, it's going to be about the exposure triangle. And if you imagine that, there are 3 things or 3 elements that make up the exposure triangle. Those 3 things are the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. And each one of those elements do different things and they play off of each other. They affect each other and they depend on each other. We'll go through each one of those things so you can understand what those things are, the different situations that you'd want to adjust them in certain ways, what those settings look like on your camera, and just what they do as far as getting the correct balance, the correct exposure. The thing that I do love about Fujifilm cameras is that they have really good manual controls. You know, when you're learning cameras, learning the exposure triangle, which is probably the biggest fundamental thing to learn about your camera, about your settings. The thing I like about the Fujifilms is that they have a lot of manual dials and controls right here, so you can learn those things. It's kind of like learning how to drive a manual car. You learn how it works and you have this tactile feeling of adjusting your settings and dialing it in the right way. So again, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. The first one is shutter speed. First of all, let's talk about the sensor. If I take this lens off, you can see the sensor is that square thing right in the middle. That sensor is what takes in the light to take the picture. If you know about kind of the human sight, right? Everything that we see is because the light is reflecting off of it and entering into our eyes, and we can see those objects, we can see the scene. It's the same thing with this, right? When we take the picture, there is a shutter that opens up, exposes the sensor to the light, takes in the picture, the scene that it's pointed at, and then it imprints that picture, that image, onto the sensor and into your camera. This is called the shutter button. When you press that shutter button, you can imagine the shutter speed is how fast that it takes the picture. How fast that shutter opens up, lets in the light, and then closes to end the picture, basically. On the top here, and a lot of Fujifilm cameras have this, you have a shutter speed dial. You know, I have it right here at 1/4000th of a second, so that's really fast. That's a fast shutter speed. That means it will take that picture really quick. I know you like those arm motions, right? And then as we go in, we get slower shutter speeds. That dot is pointing at what shutter speed it's at. You can get, 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th, all the way down. You can have 1 second. You can have a 10-second shutter speed, 30-second shutter speed, however long you'd like to have it. And so basically that shutter is going to open up and let in all that light for as long as that shutter speed is set to, and then it will close. So let's talk about kind of your, not really standard, but kind of a good starting point when it comes to shutter speed. For me, I guess, and maybe some people disagree, but anywhere from 1/20th of a second, 1/80th of a second, that's going to be a good place to start. And then if you try it out and your picture is too bright, then you can make that shutter speed faster so it lets in less light. Or if you have it on 1/80th or even 250th of a second, but it's too dark, you can set it to where it's a slower shutter speed. It will open up and close slower and let in more light. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, one thing that you do have to take into consideration, okay? When you press that shutter button and the shutter opens, if you're hand holding your camera, sometimes that sensor is going to pick up all the little micro jitters, micro vibrations of your hand. And so what that means is if that shutter is open for a long time, if they have a very long shutter speed, any kind of movement, any kind of vibrations, it's going to show up in your picture. If you have a slow shutter speed and your hands are really shaky, then your images are going to come out blurry because it's opening for a long time and it's taking that picture and it's capturing all that little movement. When you have a fast shutter speed, let's say I have it on 2000, right? 1/2000th of a second. Even if I do have a little bit of a shake, that shutter is opening and closing so fast that it doesn't even recognize my shake. It goes so quickly, it kind of freezes the image. It kind of freezes the scene. That's why it's important in some cameras for a lot of people to have IBIS or in-body image stabilization. Basically what that does, I've talked about in another video, in-body image stabilization is, imagine your sensor is floating, kind of has like suspension. Let's say this is your sensor. Even though my hand is shaking, that sensor, because it's on suspension, isn't going to move. So having IBIS or in-body image stabilization on your camera, and sometimes they have it on the lens, optical image stabilization on the lens, having that on your camera or on your lens helps with getting a slower shutter speed, but keeps the image clean, because even though you're shaking, your hand holding and shaking a little bit, it's going to offset that because it's floating on that suspension system. Some cameras have IBIS, some cameras don't. Some lenses have image stabilization, some lenses don't. That being said, you can make the choices, the artistic choices, to set your shutter speed fast or slow based on what you're trying to do in your pictures. For example, I'm sure a lot of us have seen those really cool waterfall pictures or those river pictures where you can see the water, those lines, those white lines, kind of a dreamy looking effect. How those photographers got that effect was they had that shutter open really long so that the moving water, the motion of the water would be imprinted onto the pictures. You can see that motion, you can see those white lines. If you had a faster shutter speed and you just took a picture of a waterfall or a river, it would just kind of freeze everything. You wouldn't see the movement in the river, you wouldn't see the movement in the waterfall. Those are the artistic choices that you can make with choosing your shutter speed. Another way that you can use shutter speed artistically, let's say for example, you're taking a picture at night of the highways or some roads, right? We've all kind of seen those pictures where you can see those lights, the trail of lights from the cars, and you can see it moving all along the highway. So if you're taking a picture and you open up that shutter speed for a long time, whenever those cars move down the highway, your sensor is going to pick up their taillights, pick up all the headlights, pick up all the movement of those cars and have a really cool streak of light. In the same way that they got the waterfall effect, that's the same way you can do that light trail effect. And even when you've seen probably people doing light art. So what they'll do is they'll have that shutter speed open really long, and they'll have a little flashlight or little glow sticks, and they will draw with that light, with those glow sticks. Because the shutter is open for so long, it will trace and it will get all of those light trails, and so that's how you can get those kinds of light drawings. So that's it for shutter speed. Hopefully that makes sense on understanding how that affects your exposure. The second one is aperture. The best way to explain it is if you imagine your eye and your pupil, right? The little black part in the center of your eye. That is the little window that lets light in. And in the camera, that little window lets light into the sensor. So sometimes that pupil is going to be super big, which lets in a lot of light. And sometimes that pupil is going to be super small. That aperture is going to be super small, which lets in very little light. So you see the aperture getting smaller right now, and you can see it widening up. And that's as I move the aperture ring these different numbers, it's going to close and it's going to open. So if I set it to a low number, and this is where it gets a little confusing because it seems like opposite. So the lower the number, the wider the aperture. The higher the number, the smaller the aperture. And so when it's wide open, they call it a fast aperture. So a fast aperture lens is a lens that has a really low number, which means it has a really wide aperture. This one is pretty wide. It goes down to f1.2. It's a really nice portrait lens here. And then most lenses will have the max f16. That means it's a really, really tiny pinhole aperture. And then as I open it up, here is f8, here's f4, here's f2. Okay, you can see it getting smaller. So wide open, it is huge. That is f1.2. So depending on your lens, it's going to have different maximum apertures or different wideness. Usually the lenses that get super wide, like this one, those are going to be bigger and they're going to cost a little bit more. So I have a few lenses here. Maximum aperture on this lens is f2. It's pretty decent, not too bad. This one gets a little better. This has an aperture of f1.4. Here on this lens, actually both of these lenses, you'll see the maximum aperture of both of these lenses are f2.8. So what does that mean? At nighttime, usually our pupils get super wide so that we can gather in as much light as possible. And it's the same thing with cameras. If I have a super wide open aperture, then that means I'm going to be able to take in a lot more light. So if you're doing nighttime photos, if you're doing night photography, you'll want a lens that can go down to, I would say 2 is decent, but really if you're taking a lot of, concert photography, things like that, you'll want it at least, f1.4, at least on the Fuji system. f2 is good too, but, obviously you want the lowest number, you want the widest aperture. But let's say, for example, you're at the beach, it's super sunny, it's super bright. If you have that wide open to f2, f1.2, your pictures might just get blown out and just be super bright, super white. You can't see anything. You'd want to stop it down. That's what it's called. You stop it down to maybe f4 to f8. And another thing, when we're talking about like rule of thumb kind of standards, this range right here, f4 to f8, usually that on most lenses is where you're going to get the best image quality, the sharpest image quality. Yes, you can have it opened up to f2 or f1.4, f1.2. You can do that and the image quality might still be great, but as you stop it down to f4, f5.6, f8, the image quality is going to start getting cleaner and sharper. But hey, if you need all the light you can get, open that baby wide open, especially for night photography, concert photography, you're just trying to get as much light as you possibly can. So again, that's just a rule of thumb. Everybody has their preferences. Some people might not agree or whatever, but like I said, I'm not an expert, but that's just kind of what I've heard and what I've learned along the way. Another thing, the main thing that people adjust their aperture for is something called bokeh, or background blur. Usually for new photographers, they're trying to get that background blur because that's kind of the thing that makes you feel like, I have a good camera, I'm a photographer, which, that's great. It's not completely true, but it's great to have that, and it's great to experiment that with that, especially if you're a new photographer. You want to get that nice creamy background blur, that bokeh. So the aperture has a lot to do with that. The lower the number of the aperture, which means the wider the aperture opening, the more blurred and the more creamy your background is going to be. That's the main thing. There are some other things that affect the bokeh, like the distance, between the lens and the subject. To keep it simple for beginner photography, the aperture is going to be the main thing that affects background blur. Or when people do portrait mode on their phones, right? Everything behind you is all creamy. You can't really see anything. It's all blurred out. But the subject, the person that you're focusing on, they are sharp, they are in focus, they pop out because everything behind them is blurry. That is a digital recreation of bokeh that uses computational stuff and algorithmic stuff to fake blur the background. And sometimes it looks wonky, sometimes it doesn't get it right. But when you're talking about cameras, it has that natural bokeh because it's actually opening up and closing down the aperture on an actual lens. So that's where you get that real bokeh from, that real background blur. I know that as a beginner photographer, you want all your pictures to be bokeh'd out. But keep in mind, as you develop more, you're going to understand not all your pictures have to be wide open. Not all your pictures have to be at their widest aperture setting. Sometimes you want the background to be in focus. Understanding your aperture settings, it's going to help with that. It's going to be that balance of what you're trying to do and how do you get it, whether it be aperture, ISO, shutter speed. So again, another thing that I love about the Fuji cameras is that you have these manual controls. Most lenses on the Fuji system will come with an aperture ring on the lens, so you can adjust it in real time. You can adjust it, look down at it, and just choose what aperture you want. And I can do that just right here. Again, a lot of Fuji users like that manual control. They like to have it tactile. It gives you a feeling of that old school film. But also, for me, it's just a better way to learn the camera, learn how to tweak your exposure settings on the fly. So I think that's pretty invaluable. But yeah, I just like that most of, not all, but most of the Fujifilm lenses come with aperture rings. Now, that doesn't mean all of them do. These two lenses are made by the same company. It's a third-party company called Viltrox, and they make lenses for Fuji, for Sony system, for Nikon. But you can see on this lens, it has an aperture ring right over here. Same company, still on the Fuji system. This lens does not have an aperture ring. So it just depends on the lens itself. It depends on the manufacturer. Some of them don't have aperture rings, some of them do. Now, here are my thoughts on that. When it comes to photography, as in stills photos, I very, very much prefer having an aperture ring on my lens. It's the way that I learned photography. For me, it's just a part of my workflow is having the aperture right at my hands right here that I can adjust. It's just what I prefer. I like having that tactile feeling of changing my aperture right here on the lens because that frees up these other knobs, these other customizable controls, and I can just see it. I can see it right there. I know where it's at without having to look at the screen, without having to look at the viewfinder. I know what the aperture is at because I have it set there physically on the dial. So for stills photography, I very much prefer having an aperture ring on the lens. Now, when it comes to video, I don't really change my aperture that much. I usually have it wide open. It doesn't matter as much, if at all. But to each their own. Everyone has their own workflow, everyone has their own preferences. That being said, I still will use this for photos. It's just a little bit of an annoyance. I'm so used to just turning it on the lens, but whenever I have this lens for photos and I want to adjust the aperture, I have to remember to use this. I think I've said enough about aperture and what it does, the settings, how you adjust it on the camera, all that stuff. The last point on the exposure triangle is something called ISO. ISO. On some cameras, they will have an ISO dial right over here. On mine, on this camera, I don't have a physical ISO dial, but I have it mapped to this one on the back. If you look right over here, you can see me adjusting the ISO. It's getting larger, the number's getting bigger, and that's my forehead. But yeah, it basically adjusts kind of the brightness. For me, it's the last thing I adjust on the exposure triangle, but it helps to adjust the brightness and the darkness of your exposure. The rule of thumb is that for most people, they will try to have the ISO at the lowest number possible. So on my camera, the lowest ISO goes down to 125. And usually the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image, but also the darker the image. The higher you crank up the ISO, it will introduce a lot of graininess and distortion and digital, yeah, just some digital distortion. Let's say you get it to 32,000 over here and higher, maybe 32,000, 6,400, and going even higher all the way up to, you know, 128,000. I read that as 128,000, but you know, it's 12,800. No one says 12,800. I don't know. Like, we've all seen those pictures on digital cameras where it was just super distorted and super grainy and super gnarly. That's because the ISO was cranked up super high. Let's say, for example, I'm trying to take concert photography. If I have too high of a shutter speed, then maybe if I'm taking a picture of a band or a singer or something like that, they're going to be moving a lot. And so if I have a super slow shutter speed, it's going to be blurry. They're going to be moving too fast, and my shutter is going to be open too long to where it's going to, you know, it's not going to freeze them. So instead, I would want something with a super wide open aperture, right? That lets in a lot of the light. That's where, you know, a nice 1.4, 1.2 f2 might struggle a little bit more, but you can make it happen. You can make it work. But let's say, for example, your lens only goes down to f2.8 or maybe even f3.5. What I'll do is crank up the ISO as much as it'll go. And then you're just having that balance between, okay, how much can I crank this ISO up before it starts getting super grainy, super digitally distorted. So again, like I said, with all of these things, they play into getting that correct balance of exposure. That's why it's important to understand all three of those elements, understand how they affect the exposure, understand how they affect your scene, and what's important, what you need to prioritize depending on your scene. Again, when we're talking about if you're at a scene where it's super bright daylight, you need your shutter speed to be higher to not let in so much light. You need your aperture to be smaller. And then I can put my ISO all the way down to its floor. So all of those things, the more you understand about those three elements, the more you understand about the exposure triangle, the better you'll be equipped for every scenario, every situation, and understanding what you're trying to do, how to get it, and getting the right balance, getting the right exposure. One last thing that I want to talk about. It's not a part of the exposure triangle per se, but it can affect the exposure in your images. So let's say I put my camera to auto mode. The camera is going to make the decisions. The camera is going to choose what it thinks is the best shutter speed, what it thinks is the best aperture, and what it thinks is the best ISO for the situation. So that's where this exposure compensation dial comes into play. 0 right here, think of that as just kind of the baseline. If I put it on 0 and I have my camera on auto, my camera will make the decisions to try to get it as evenly exposed as possible. So not too dark, not too bright, just kind of where it thinks is the right amount of exposure. But let's say I want my picture to be darker. It's still on auto mode, so I can't change the aperture settings, I can't change the shutter speed settings, and I can't change the ISO settings. So what I can do is I can turn the exposure compensation dial to negative 0.3, negative 0.7, negative 1. And when I do that, the image or the exposure will be darker. And again, going the opposite way, if I want the image and exposure to be brighter, I can turn it up to positive right there. That's important to know if you're a beginner, if you're starting out and you don't want to manually choose your shutter speed, manually choose your ISO, manually choose your aperture, and you just want to put it on auto mode. You can still adjust the exposure, you can still adjust the brightness and the darkness of your picture, of your image, by adjusting the exposure compensation dial. So 0 is your baseline. You can go negative to go darker, positive to go brighter. We'll get more on the different modes in another video. That's fully automatic mode. You have other modes like the A, that means aperture priority. So this will let you adjust your aperture, but it will make the decisions on the other things. Does that make sense? If you have it on one of these priority modes or automatic modes, where the camera is making the decisions for you, whether it be all 3 of those things or just one of them or 2 of them, then that's when you're going to be wanting to use the exposure compensation dial to make your images darker or brighter. We'll get into that a little bit more in other videos. So I think that's it. That's at least for kind of a beginner's understanding of those 3 things and a beginner's understanding of the exposure triangle. That's the main things you need to know. Those are the 3 things that affect your exposure, the 3 things that you can adjust manually, and what those things do, how they work, how they affect the exposure, and a few ways, a few kind of popular ways people adjust those settings and use those settings depending on the effect that they're trying to get in their photography. Hopefully that helped. You know, just remember shutter speed, aperture, ISO, the 3 elements that make up the exposure triangle. Hopefully that made sense. If you have any questions, if I wasn't clear on anything, if you had further questions on other things, put those questions in the comments. I don't want people to just comment just for the sake of commenting. I want my videos to be helpful. I want my dialogue to be helpful. So if there are topics or things that you didn't fully understand, or that maybe I could do better on explaining, take it easy on me, but just let me know, and I might make videos in the future more in depth on certain things. Also, you know, I said this in another video of mine, whenever I'm watching YouTube videos and I come across a video that's helpful or that I can relate to or that, you know, I connect with, or that's just helpful to me, it really, for me, it doesn't take much time or effort at all to give that video a like. Or if I really like, you know, the vibe of the videos of a certain creator, it's so easy for me to subscribe and it doesn't cost me anything really. But I'll tell you that for the creator, every like, every comment, every subscriber, it means a lot. And for me personally, what that means is, you know, it's not just about engagement or whatever, but it means that I am reaching somebody. It means that I'm helping somebody. Especially the purpose of this channel is to help beginner photographers and help them understand and break down these terms and these settings and these ideas that might be a little just complex or confusing, but I get to help explain that to where you can understand it in a very digestible way, in a way that doesn't go over the heads of beginners. And so that's what I love about it. And that's what, every subscriber, every like on my videos, that's what it means to me. And that's what it signifies to me. But more so, I want to make sure that if you're here, that you're here because you're getting something from my videos. You're getting something from my perspective and how I'm explaining things. But the main thing is, I don't want engagement for engagement's sake. I don't want to have, my friends and family follow my channel, but they don't even care about photography. That's not the point of this. I want people who this helps. I want people who can contribute, even if you're not a beginner photographer, if you're a little bit more intermediate or more advanced, maybe your insight, your comments on my videos can help other people. It can help me even. Like I said, I never claimed to be an expert. I never claimed to be a very experienced photographer. I'm growing and I'm learning and I'm sharing the knowledge that I do have. Maybe you're in my shoes where I was just a few months or years ago, but I'm able to help you, from what I've learned in my experience. So all that to say, I really do appreciate everyone that is on here, everyone that's watching the video. My last video on the 4 Fujifilm cameras that I would recommend to beginners, that got a lot more views than I would expect, and it got me, a lot more subscribers than I would expect. So again, what that signals to me is that people are looking for someone to help them. There are beginner photographers who that is helping. And so I'm super grateful for that. Enough of the sentimental ideals, but thank you so much for being here. Hopefully, I can keep on making these videos, keep on helping beginner photographers. So I appreciate it. It's fun for me. Let's keep going. Thanks so much. Bye.